everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got Peter Jones back to the channel. How are you, Pete?
Mr. Kerr, I'm doing well. Nice to see you and glad to be here for another conversation.
Absolutely. It's part of the Deep Purple and Family show, the regular show that we do on Daydream Nation. Today's topic is a discussion about Mark III Deep Purple. Legendary status, or perhaps overrated or overstated? Pete, you brought this topic to the table. Maybe you could start with some introductory comments and we'll just have a free-form discussion about Deep Purple Mark III. Overrated, overstated, or legendary status?
The whole thing started when I read an article that had been floating around. It was kind of probably a rehash. But it was Glenn Hughes' comments about how he was not going to have any more interaction with Gillen, Glover, and Pace anymore because of their encounter at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the induction and what happened there. And I kind of read it, and he's like, well, they were rude. Well, they've always been rude. And he made a comment, which I thought was kind of, coffee calling the kettle black kind of thing. He's like, well, I was the only one sober in the room, and I don't, it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I was just thinking for a second, I looked at that Mark III and I was just posing the question to myself. He seemed like someone who pulls the Deep Purple moniker out when it is to help his career, but otherwise, I really don't get the sense he'd rather be associated with it very much. And so then I was thinking, so how does that impact how we think about that Mark III? Is it, is it level? Is it below? Is it whatever? And that's what kind of made me think about it. So that's what caused the reaching out to you about this conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Timing's quite unusual, isn't it? Because what is Glenn Hughes promoting at the moment? There is a Black Country Communion album 5, and a lot of these headlines seem to correspond with the release of the album. So my view is that he's got an album to plug. One of the media folk has asked the question, and it does pop up, and he's really kind of expanded on it. Because there was always, it's been reported previously that the folk in Mark II weren't very friendly with the folk in Mark III, but he's actually gone that extra leg and been more prescriptive as to what happened and his feelings in respect of that night and how he feels today. So do you think it's coincidental that maybe he's plugging an album?
I don't put past promotion on any artist. Because, the edict of no press, bad press is still press. All press is good. Give them a platform and then be able to, pivot and say, oh, by the way, I've also got this coming out, or I've got a book, or I've got, this and that and the other thing. It just seemed odd that, at this stage that would even come out again and that I would see it and the inner workings between those different marks, is an interesting thing. And, if you want, I was going to make just a little couple timeline things here if I could. How this all started, of course, we know a lot about it, but just give a quick recap. June 29th, 73. The Gillen era ends in Osaka, Japan. They're done. He basically walks off stage. Nobody really says anything to him. He gets on a plane and goes home. But it didn't take long for Purple to keep moving, because by June and July of 73, Purple, the guys that were left had already checked out Trapeze. They knew about Glenn. They had heard him. And, of course, the mystery man in all of this was Paul Rodgers, because Blackmore had reached out to Paul to be the lead singer. And Hughes was approached with that as the possibility. And when asked, he said, well, I wrote this down. Hughes wanted the opportunity to play with a really great player, and that was Paul Rogers. And I thought that was an odd thing to say. You didn't mention Blackmore, you didn't mention Pacey, and you didn't mention Lord. And I thought that was kind of odd. And he also has said in other interviews he wasn't really a fan of their music. Is a style he really didn't care about. He didn't like the extended jamming very much. And so I'm like, okay. And then, of course, Paul says no. And they bring in David, and off we go. And they play their first gig in December of 73. So, I mean, it was less than 6 months. They're boom out there ready to go, and off they go. If we're talking about legacies, I think there's some things here that we need to consider. When Glenn and David joined the band, I don't think it is much of a stretch to say that Purple was probably the biggest band on the planet. There's a lot of carryover that those guys were able to take advantage of. The big gigs, you get the Cal Jam, not because you're Glenn and David, it's because of who Purple was before that. Mark II gets you that gig. If they were a new band, I mean, obviously they're not even in the conversation, but they weren't. They had a legacy. They already had the cachet. They were it. Now, if they were to come out with a really crappy record, that would have been different, but they didn't. And you and I have talked about it, and people should go check out our show on Burn because it's epic. It's stellar, and both Peter and I praise it, rightly so, extremely high. But it's a very short tenure, barely 2 years. Blackies is out. Stormbringer is kind of a big fall off, at least in my opinion. And next thing we know, he's gone. He's got Rainbow going. They carry on for one, and then it's over. So I look at it that way, and it starts to form opinions. So I'll let you catch up, but I have more when we're done, when you're done.
Okay, no worries. Look, my view is that you cannot deny that the legendary status of Deep Purple Mark II is locked in stone. All their song set, when you see the California Jam and you see their song set for Mark III onwards, the foundation stones are of Machine Head and In Rock. So there's no doubt in any shape or form the Mark II is legendary. However, Burn was an absolute cracker of an album, and I actually rank that as my favorite Deep Purple album. I cop a little bit of stick over it, but it is ranked very highly in a lot of people's rankings of Deep Purple into this day, and I get the vibe that over time it's one of those albums that has attained legendary status. It went top 10 in America. I think it only attained gold certification, but that's kind of debatable, Pete, because a lot of these bands, these legacy bands, need to get these albums recertified. I think it could be easily double platinum. And a lot of the Purple albums, when you look at the RIAA, you look at Purple, you go, wow, they didn't sell that many. But they just need to get it recertified.
I have a list that I got from a website, so I'll use this as a reference point. These are kind of worldwide tallies. Machine Head is just a little bit over 9 million worldwide. Burn is at a little over 4 million. So that's nothing to sneeze at. 4 million records is a ton. It's only bested by In Rock and Perfect Strangers.
Yep.
So, and there's then Fireball. Who do we think we are? Both over 3 million, and Stormbringer is at 7, just under 3 million.
Yep.
So there are definitely albums that made an impact. I kind of still feel a little unsettled though about it. Not the quality. Let's make sure we understand here. This is not about the quality of the music. As you stated, I think Mark II is so substantially higher that it's not even a fair fight. You know, it's just, to me, it's just the most epic thing. And then we had this short period, 2 studio records. That's it. That's not a long period of time.
But I think Burn is such an outstanding album, and I think that there are a lot of bands that have built their legacy of being a one-shot album, and they've gone into the superstar status. Let's face it, like Guns N' Roses, which I know I first met you on the Contrarians, and that's really the album that they've been dining their whole career on, and that was like lightning in the bottle. So Burn is kind of like one shot. It's great. I actually rank Stormbringer a lot higher. I call it very good. It's not like top tier Deep Purple, but I think it's very good. But it's more reflective, the style of music of Glenn Hughes, and to a lesser extent David Coverdale, when they were going into the more funk and soul direction of music. And that's valid, that's fine. But getting back to the legendary status, I think that Mark III has the legendary status because of Burn. And over time, because of David Coverdale's work in Whitesnake, which was, to be quite frank, by record sales and concert ticket sales in the 80s and 90s, were a much bigger act than Deep Purple. Like 1987 is almost diamond certification. It probably, if they got it recertified, it probably would be diamond certification. That's lightning in a bottle. And I think that David Coverdale and Whitesnake is probably more well known to the following generation of rock folk. And that's kind of breathed life and oxygen into the assertion that Mark III is at legendary status because of maybe the subsequent vehicles. Now, you've got Glenn Hughes. Now, let's be honest. Glenn is in a lot of media. He loves talking about himself. He beats himself up. He is one of the most self-marketed rock stars out there. He loves beating his own drum. He's got a full of ego. And I'm not saying anything controversial, folks. It is what it is. And it's part of his shtick, part of his charm. But when you look at the dollars and cents and his ranking and where he is, he's kind of a cult hero. He plays the clubs, like he's playing Sydney in October. I'm going to do a meet and greet. Hope you're still, Glenn, if you're watching, please be nice. I love you, mate. I love you. But he is at that club level. He's not stadiums. And you look at his career, and he is been in that category of could have been a contender. You know, the old Marlon Brando could have been a contender.
Right.
So much potential, so much, you know, he could have given so much, but because of the publicized drug addictions and substance abuse, his career was sort of went on the skids, and he was like relegated to guest stars. You know, he'd be going from project to project, and he only sort of corrected himself into the 90s. And but still then he was very much a cult artist. So, but I guess if you're sorry, Pete, if you're at that level and you're in a cult level, how do you bring yourself into the fore and get yourself noticed? Go back to where you were. And he was a member of the Deep Purple Club, and that's his marketing pitch, and that's his hook to get people to take notice that, hey, Black Country Communion, number 5, new album. I've got a new solo album. I've got a tour. He's got to go back and dine into the mine, which is Deep Purple. So,
well, and you contrast that with how relatively quiet Gillan and Pace and Glover are. because they really don't talk. They don't say anything, and the only time they are really, is when someone will throw a mic in their face and ask them about you getting back with Richie or whatever, and it's the same answer. Why should we? The ship sailed. No, no, thank you. Whatever. And so they are not talkers. They don't push themselves. And to put things in perspective, we talk about first the Morris era, and when you look at these numbers based on that same list, we're looking perpendicular 600,000, abandoned 300,000. I mean, that is a shell of what these, Mark II and Mark III were able to do sales wise. They didn't have nearly the numbers. They played way more concerts. That part's not even close. I'm looking at 146 shows from Perpendicular, 130 for Abandon. This was a band who was just on the road all the time.
And folks, this was still when CDs were selling. So in the 90s, we couldn't bring this up if we were talking about the sales of the Deep Purple's albums in the 2000s, because we're in the age of social media and file sharing and various things, and record sales are, of no relevance. But in the 90s, they were still ticking over, weren't they?
And I'm going to ask maybe a challenging or impossible question. Please give a percentage of who is most responsible for the success of Burn, of between the 5 members.
It's Richie Blackmore.
Okay.
Richie Blackmore is the guy. He's the main man. It's wrapped around him. And then you have Pacey, and then you have Lord. So you've got the foundation. The singers, which sound magnificent on this album. You've got this new guy called David Coverdale, who drunkenly sent in some sort of shabby tape, and John Lord listened to it, and he heard that there was a particular tonality that he really liked, took a punt, and it paid off in spades. And then you've got Glenn Hughes of the Stevie Wonder and the Soul Voice. They're like the Sam and Dave. Wonderfully, it's like the spice on top of a wonderful meal. But Blackmore and then Pace and Lord, they're the foundation. I can't give you a scientific Martin Popov percentage, but I can certainly say that it'd be the majority of the pie chart would be those 3. What do you think, Pete?
Well, that's probably my reason for asking, because I believe that it is a substantial, if not most, of the pie. And I think when I think about Mark III and what I hear from Glenn, and not so much from David is very humble. He's always just been grateful. He's been polite. He's been respectful. That somehow I get the sense from Glenn, and maybe wrongly, that he is trying to take more credit than he probably deserves. He doesn't sing that much on the record. When he does, it's very good. But he doesn't sing that much. And they had played together for years and years. Blackmore and Pace and Lord were absolutely in full prime. I dare say this, maybe you could have kind of brought in almost anybody, and it probably would have been really good. I
think it's marketing, and don't take offense to this, but I don't get offended by what he's doing, because I think that if you're a member of a premium club and you've got to market yourself, then I can understand why he's pitching it in that direction. He's hanging his hook on the legacy of Deep Purple to basically get people to notice his own music. And it's
Right.
so competitive out there.
Oh,
It's
sure it
not
is.
like the 80s and the 90s, and he's got to use every device. And I'm sure that, maybe he's got a publicist that he uses, and they wouldn't have been terribly displeased with the amount of media coverage that it got through the various music websites about that little stoush with Mark II at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But
Right.
it kind of backfired because everyone was focused on the angst and the antagonism that occurred, but there was not much spoken about the Black Country Communion #5. I don't know what it's like being in the States, but it seems to be a very low wattage type of uh, push for this album.
Yeah, it's not knocking anybody's doors down,
Yeah,
and I will draw a distinction, and I don't begrudge any artist from trying to get himself or their organization noticed. I mean, that's just the way it has to be. To me, the extreme on the far side is someone, in my opinion, like a Joe Lynn Turner, who wants to take credit after being in the band that he was the perfect match with Blackmore, and Blackmore thought I was this great, and I'm like, okay, too much, too far. You did one record. Clearly, the public spoke. The rest of the band finally spoke up and said, sorry, Joe, you may be a great singer, but your contributions to Purple are a pinhead. Let's not keep saying, well, when I was in Purple, I did that, So that's the extreme. Obviously, Glenn is somewhere in the middle. And you say, well, what does that have to do with how we look at Mark III and, in comparison? Is it overrated? You can't release Burn and be overrated. I I don't see how you can. Do we talk about other bands that have short periods with singers, or do we, is Paul Di'Anno underrated now because of the legacy of how long Maiden's gone with Bruce? No, not to most Maiden fans who came in very early, who have a strong affinity to those first. They would tell you that Bruce is the anomaly, even with
yeah.
all the history.
He still
So
gets talked about. Just two
yeah,
albums, and they
it,
a lot of folk still talk about those first two albums.
so maybe it's not so much about quantity.
Yes.
Two great records, and the thing that was different about them at this time, which I also think really bolsters the Mark III lineup, at least to more diehards like ourselves, is that they were exceptionally prolific with their live recordings. They were all over the place. And we talked about those on a show. Please go check that out. You've got the Cal Jam live in London, the Mark III final concerts. You've got San Diego 74, Made in Europe, Paris 75. I mean, we can go on and on and on. That era had and put out way, way, way more live material than Mark II ever has. Now, there's a lot of bootlegs and that kind of stuff, but I'm even talking just official releases. So you get the sense that this band was just, around forever. When you look at Stormbringer, they only did 33 shows, and Blackmore was gone.
Yeah,
That is,
off to the castle.
yeah,
Castle Rock. Yes.
that's barely even getting started. 33
Yeah.
shows. You're still working
Well,
out stage kinks. It was done. They were gone.
yeah. Like I said in that show with Michael Ladano, I think Blackers was checking out. But even when he was checking out, and in my humble opinion, it was a very good quality album. And, he was being pushed to do songs that he didn't even want to do. Like there
No.
was one song where he played a lead break on his thumb because he just point blank didn't like that type of music, the soul music. But look, just going back a little bit, backtracking
Sure.
about you said that anybody could have sung. I'm sorry, I think it's a little harsh because I really think their voices on that album. That their vocal performances are just sublime, and I just couldn't imagine anybody else. But yeah, look, there could be some other folk that could have sung on that album, but I think it's lightning in the bottle with Burn, and you've got a beautiful contrast where you've got David Coverdale with that deep masculine voice, which
Right.
Black has always said that he loved that sort of really manly voice,
Right.
and it contrasts with the higher pitched vocals of Glenn Hughes, the more soulful R&B type of voice. It works so perfectly. It's like the Sam and Dave. However, live, that's where it's sometimes got a little bit wavery. Now, Made in Europe is a superb live album, and it really picks on some diamond chip live performances of Mark III. But
Right.
I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate here, folks. I've heard a lot of Mark III live shows where it gets a little bit wavery, where Glenn Hughes kind of showboats a little bit, and sort of it gets a bit competitive between DC and Glenn as to who's the lead singer, and it's sort of, the boundaries are sort of blurred and not defined, and it gets a bit messy. What do you think about that?
I think that's an excellent point, Peter, and it's because of a lot of factors. It is not a secret that Mark III was both, what's the right word I want to use? Not very conducive. David and Glenn were not set up as singers to handle the Mark II era well. Neither one of them, or in combination, the songs they did do from Mark II and from the very first show, it's the only thing they do is Smoke on the Water, Space Truckin', and they end with Highway Star. And the Mark II were reconfigured. They were kind of rewritten, and, harmonies on the last verse of Smoke on the Water. Space Truckin', we saw what goes on with that, but mostly that's only a couple verses with a ton of jamming, and that was all the instrumentalists. And David, I don't think, ever really sounded comfortable on Highway Star, not to my ears, because their singing style is so vastly different. So you have a band that comes out off this legacy that, in fact, allows them to have the marquee that they're experiencing, but in a sense, ignoring the marquee era that has them to the elevated status that they're actually at. And so for me, that was a very different kind of thing. And of course, we have a lot of people who say, why won't Gillan do something from Burn? Why won't Gillan? Because he won't. Because he's just not gonna. I don't want to hear Ian Gillan sing Burn. Not when you've got the legacy they have, plus all the new material they wrote over the decades with Steve. He's got more material he doesn't have to do. So there is a source of friction. I don't sing yours, you don't sing mine.
Yeah. Well,
and they
I think Mark
butt heads.
Yeah, they do. And I think Mark III had to sing that material because Machine Head was still selling.
Yes.
In Rock was still selling.
Right.
Made in Japan was still selling. They had to sing those songs. So there's just, in no shape or form could they avoid not singing Highway Star, Space Trucking, Smoke on the Water. There'd be an absolute riot in the streets because that actually was a chart hit. They had wrapped their Mark III songs around that and built that up as much as they could. But yeah, look,
just to prove the point, Smoke on the Water moved to the middle of the set. It wasn't a closer. And that tells you everything you need to know about how they were feeling about the Mark II stuff. There was no lazy. There wasn't, because Glenn specifically, and not as much David, didn't buy into that bluesy, jammy style of writing. that wasn't his forte. That's not their gig.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually think DC does a decent version of Lazy. Out of all the Mark II songs, I think that's the one that's kind of closer to the bluesy DC, which you would see a little bit more in Whitesnake, especially in
Right.
the early years. But the other songs, yeah, it's a little bit oil and water. But it's interesting with the lyrics with Smoke on the Water. He doesn't say, he says they. He refers in the sense
Yes.
they all went out to, and then the lyrics.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point. You weren't going, and it has to be strange, no different than when Bruce joined or anybody else we've talked about. They're so huge. You go to see them and you're like, oh, I can't wait to hear Speed King. I can't wait to hear this. And you're like, nope, you're not going to get them. And I think the legacy part that does hold up is, to tie it in, is that because the instrumentalists were so strong and the song and materials were so good, that they could say, okay, fine, but we're going to play stuff from our new record, and it still sounded so much like Deep Purple. And that was their power. Their mojo was live. And Pacey, as a drummer, may not have a better period than 73-ish through Come Taste the Band. His playing is off the charts, and that's already from a high standard from the Mark II era. My God, his playing was insane, a monster, because they were busier. And
listen to that, Burn, unbelievable.
Yeah, everything that he was doing was just way not over the top, crazy, wrong, just Richie, for whatever dissatisfactions he may have had, and that clearly came out sonically and compositionally in Stormbringer. But live, good grief, he took everything up to a new level. He got more vicious. And of course, Blackmore plays great when he's angry. He does.
Look at Hell and High Water with Ian Gillan.
Sure.
So much fire in the belly, because I think he knew he was not going to be in the band much longer and it was going to be videotaped, and he just went for it. Just going back to the legend status, because I am of the view that this lineup, Mark III, is legend status. Simply, you could wrap it around Burn. You go to a store, what is the video that people go to for Deep Purple, or what's available? What's the biggest selling Deep Purple live video?
Yes,
California Jam.
Yeah, right.
That's a document. So a lot of folk that introduce themselves to Deep Purple see that and think that's Deep Purple.
Right. Yeah, and if, and I've seen very, very small snippets, because they did film the Made in Japan shows from 72. They've even got footage from 73 in Japan, because they film everything over there. But that long form stuff never came out, or was never marketed, or never presented, because quality was not there, or is incomplete, or was damaged or lost or whatever. So that stuff doesn't exist. Mark III fell into a perfect storm of, like we said, already being on the pedestal because they were Deep Purple. Plus, they had the marquee show, the Cal Jam. They had the video performance. It was on American television. All of these things, all the live shows that came out with it. So it elevated where a lot of people would think, wow, this period must have gone on for 3, 4, 5 years. Nope. It's this short, folks, and it was all truncated into this tiny little thing, but it was, I don't want to say in your face in a bad way. It was just always there. There was always something. It's like, oh, get Made in Europe. Oh, here comes Live in London. Oh, I got to get that. Oh, you just kept getting more and more Mark III stuff, way more than you could get versus the studio and official live records for Mark II. So from that standpoint, from a collector and a lover of the band, Mark III was a feast because you could just get as much stuff as you could handle. And that also helps propel them and lifts them up in both recognition and in status, which I can't argue with, and I think that's an important thing to talk about. They really had a much bigger push, in the public eye versus Mark II up until 73.
Absolutely. I'll ask you a question, Pete. If Whitesnake wasn't the uber mega stadium success story of 1987, do you think that Mark III would have been at that legendary status? Because I think that there's a lot of, as I said earlier in the show, a lot of oxygen is pumped into this around Mark III being legends because of what David did subsequent.
Another great question, and let me tie it back to something I was going to address but failed to finish my point. You were talking about occasionally Glenn maybe overstepping. Part of that was Glenn's personality, but part of it was the newness and, let's just use the word, shyness or uncomfortableness that David came into the band with. He was kind of a statue. Didn't move around a lot, was not very animated. He was getting his feet. He certainly didn't present what became the mic wielding, Robert Plant-like strutting monster that he became. And to his credit, kudos, man, because he learned, and he learned well, and he worked hard, and he transformed himself. So having a singer that kind of didn't take the front, and I think it would have been way, way different. He would have never done that to Paul Rodgers. No way. Rodgers would have just looked at him like, back in your place, bud. Paul would have never stood for that. I'm not saying he could get away with it, but there was more room for Glenn to do that because of the personality of David at the time and his little more withdrawn presence. He hadn't become the front man per se, even though he was the one without the instrument out front. So I think there's that. And now I've completely lost your original question. What did you ask me?
I said that if David wasn't so uber successful with Whitesnake in 87, do you think this assertion that Mark III's legendary status is valid?
Oh, it certainly helps it substantially.
Yeah.
There's no question. Because I think even more so than Glenn, David's rise and his prominence, especially, and it was a ways later, 87's a long way from 74, really cast back to say, you know what? He really was the real deal. And look at him. This guy is the goods. He may not be fully developed yet, but you can see it. We know it's coming. And we're like, yeah. And that makes that Mark III just kind of a little more solid. And you go, yep. I mean, if we had never heard from David again, different story,
yes.
I think.
Yes. Could you imagine going to the California Jam, and this is one of his very first gigs? He's got a check for $1 million in the back pocket of his jeans. There's all the absolute chaos that's happening where they're jostling as to what their start time, because apparently the band was going to start at a particular time where it was...
It's sunset.
Yeah.
Per their contract.
Yeah, and Blackers wanted to push it out to, a certain time where it's more effective.
Well,
and refused to come out of the trailer.
Yeah, I guess... in the rare only time in festival history, the show was actually running ahead. And the guys came to him and said, well, we're ready. You can go on. And Blacker says, no, it says we go on. It's sunset. It's not sunset yet. We're not going on yet. And he waited. That's for the long delay. So sorry to.
Yeah. And then you've got all these established artists around you, and then you've got the Blackmore and the pyrotechnics that went that could have actually killed somebody. With the what was it, a petrol bomb almost?
Yeah, they put it in the back of the cabinet, the speaker cabinet, and obviously used way more than they should have. And
Ian Pace's glasses.
His glasses blow off. And there's some great alternate camera angles that you can find from that clearly don't have the ABC quality, but you can see from the different angles how big the explosion was. And all you need to do is look at Blackmore when he's doing that little archback thing. That's not him pirouetting, folks. That was the shock concussion almost blowing him off the front of the stage.
Yeah.
And he told ABC, and he was already angry with ABC because they were pressuring him to go on ahead of their contract. So he was already mad. We already mentioned what Blackers is like playing wise when he's mad. And oh my God, did he play his ass off. But the camera guy just kept invading his space, and Richie wasn't going to have it. And is there any better TV anywhere than him pounding on that thing with his Strat? That's epic. You can talk about the Who breaking stuff, or Hendrix lighting his guitar on fire. A guy who is slamming onto a broadcast camera while they are broadcasting live. I love that.
Yeah.
I understand it was a $75,000 bill that in 1974, you go do the math. That's a lot of freaking money.
A lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
But it's classic. If
you
talk about Cal Jam, that's what you talk about.
It's part of folklore.
Talk about Purple.
And I'm coming to the nuts and bolts here, because I think there are three elements that support that Mark III is legendary status. And I'm talking about three events. One, California Jam.
Yep.
And Whitesnake and the subsequent success with David Coverdale. I think those three elements reinforce and support the perception of most folk that Mark III is legendary status.
I would agree.
I
would agree. And we prefaced early on and already conceded that Mark II is going to stand on its own. So this isn't are they equal?
No.
It's
I agree.
Yeah, it's have they done enough to stand on their own? And yeah, they have. No different than Diano, no different than all these other bands that have short periods of time. We're not going to, delegitimize Boston because 90% of their career is based off of one record, or GNR or some of these other bands that do that. Of course, they've got substantially longer periods of time together than what this was. This was a white hot, eruption of a whole bunch of things that all came together at once. A band was peaking instrumentally. New members were coming in. The songs just gelled. But for a very short period of time, one album later, that chemistry is gone. It doesn't translate, in my opinion, to the next record. And fiery live, intense live, big events, a lot of publicity, and then a very bad breakup and over.
With the Stormbringer album, you do concede Stormbringer and maybe Soldier of Fortune is their mighty fine songs. Do you like those two songs?
I do. I think
top shelf.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of great stuff on there. And Lady Double Dealer and the title track and everything are great. But chemistry is what it is. When you have a distant Blackmore, and it's the only time in his career that I believe this is true for me, at least sonically, where Ritchie's guitar tone didn't progress forward. He had a great tone on Burn, and it carried over because his guitar tone on the debut with Rainbow is not aggressive. This is not the same Blackmore you heard playing the intro to You Fool No One on Made in Europe. That is a chainsaw laser cutter that can go through steel walls. It's glorious. He is way, way from that. But then he came back to it on Rising and moved forward and got more aggressive since then. But those two records, Stormbringer and the debut from Rainbow, his tone became much less edgy.
Yeah, it's kind of muted. And maybe this is a topic for another show. I love the songwriting on that Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, but for the life of me, I don't understand why the production, whether it's the production or the tone, it sounds a little lifeless.
It is.
I wish it had more edge, and for me, it's a bit of a head scratch. But as I said, this could be a topic for another show.
Yeah, but the point is that an engaged Ritchie sounds like one thing, and a disengaged Ritchie sounds like something else. Yeah. I just felt he was just relegated to say, okay, whatever. You don't want to do Black Sheep in the Family, fine. Yeah, okay. Live, but see, he had things to prove. He's not unlike a free agent in a sport or something who's playing for his next contract. He's still got to go out and just be great because he's now got to market his own band that he knows is around the corner. If he comes out and slags and plays horrible, people will be like, what's the matter with Ritchie? And they're like, but he was still firing on all cylinders live. And you'd be like, oh my God, he's got his own band. Well, let's go. And of course, Ronnie saves that until it can all gel together and Rising and onward. So, it's an interesting thing. Had Stormbringer been up to the same level sonically and energy-wise as Burn, this may even be a different conversation.
Absolutely. I'll put one final question to you, and this is a curly one. Instead of Mark II reuniting for Perfect Strangers, how do you think Mark III would have gone in 1984? DC's vocals, he would have been high quality. All the players would have been pretty well still top game. How do you think they would have? Do you think they would have put a not too shabby album together?
Here may be the ultimate of all the questions, Peter. During that lapse of time where there's no Deep Purple, fans are going, gosh, there's no Deep Purple, there's no Deep Purple, there's no Deep Purple. Which era do you think they were clamoring for more? And it's going to depend on age and everything else. If you're the older fan, you're going, man, I just listened to Made in Japan the other day. Crap.
Yeah, Mark II. I think Mark II is the answer. Yeah.
Well, and of course, they come back, and from then on, to as far as my recollection, not a single Mark III song has been played live. Not a one.
Unless Ritchie with Joe Lynn Turner. That was an opportunity when Joe Lynn came in.
I would have to check.
Burn was introduced, and he did use that opportunity to bring some Mark III. But I guess my question is, I know the fans were clamoring for Mark II. Born Again, which, despite the narrative, was actually quite a successful tour,
Yes.
Iommi and Ian Gillan on the lead singing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that sort of whetted the appetite for the America marker for Deep Purple. So I
Mm-hmm.
get that. It would have been more of a fever for Mark II in 1984. But my question is, do you think they would have put an interesting album out in an alternative universe if Mark III in 1984?
It's really hard to say. I think at that stage, it may have been even more challenging to come to a compositional consensus.
Hmm.
David was a much more confident, not only performer but writer. He had his styles. He knew what he wanted to do, and Richie had started to, I think, get a bit lost. I'm a fan of Bent Out of Shape, but I don't consider it to be like prime Rainbow. So he was not really confident or sure of what he was writing. Are they going more? I mean, does it come out as down to earth but heavier, or does it come out as Burn, or does it come out? What does it come out as? I have no idea or concept
Yeah,
what that would look like.
that would be interesting to put through the strainer because you've got Blackers, that's AOR. He wants radio hits,
Yep.
and then DC was slided in, which is more of an AC DC crunchy
Mm-hmm.
power chords with a little
Yep.
bit of pyrotechnics, you know, especially with the US remix. It's going down
Sure.
that path.
Right.
Glenn Hughes has got addictions, but maybe the point of reference is Hughes and Frawl, which is funky. And then you've got Lord and Pace, who are the stalwarts of the band, and they'll just play, you know, whatever's thrown at them and add their colour and the bottom, you know, the back end beautifully. So it would be a bit of a power struggle of
Let
some
me
musical
suggest
styles.
this. Maybe what would have happened or could have happened and it would be a kind of a break from the Mark III, that if Glover had stayed with them with Rainbow and all you did was bring in Coverdale.
I'm speechless. Wow.
To me,
There's a pause in the show, folks. I'm
well,
thinking
to
about that
me,
one.
that seems a more acrimonious kind of environment where Roger's a great team player. He's a great, kind of solidifier.
Less baggage. Less
Yes.
baggage.
Yeah.
Yes.
David would be the singer. There's no Glenn over his shoulder.
Mm.
Just David.
I might get banned at that meet and greet, Pete. No, it's all hypotheticals, folks. And that's why I enjoy having Pete Jones on this show, because why I love talking to Pete is that we just throw these little scenarios. What if? I could see it working. I could
I
see
do
it,
too.
but there wouldn't be any funk, there wouldn't be any R&B. It would be straightforward rock.
Yes. Yeah.
But
And I think that David, to some extent, could do not unlike what he did with Jimmy Page and kind of focus things again. And, take the elements of Blackmore that were the best and most important. And, at this point, Dave is ready to move into, well, okay, let's just go even more nuts. Could you hear Richie playing Still of the Night riff with Lord behind it with Pacey? I mean, riffing with Coverdale, wailing over the top with Purple behind him.
yeah, that's I think that's a bridge too far.
Well,
Yeah,
hey,
I think.
it,
It,
you have to change its delivery,
mm,
but you if you separate the riffs,
mm.
you know, um, I don't know. Maybe that's a stretch, but
Maybe it's a little stretch too far. But to be quite frank, in
reel them,
19,
reel them back in, reel them
yeah,
back in.
reel it back in. But look, to be quite frank, in '84, that was never going to happen because this was the peak of Blackers versus Coverdale. They actually came to fisticuffs
Right.
backstage,
Yeah.
I think in '83, '82. And it was beat up in the press. Kerrang magazine used to love it, where it was Rainbow versus Whitesnake, and um, apparently Coverdale turned up backstage to a Rainbow concert unannounced and was, sort of skylarking a little bit, and yeah, got into a little bit of fisticuffs, witnessed by Brian May, and read about it on social media. I think it's much more detailed than what I'm telling you. It was interesting, like with this fallout at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where there was a separation between um, Mark II and Mark III. I think there was definitely a little bit of animosity between Ian Pace and Coverdale. I don't think Ian really took kindly to being fired from Whitesnake. I've read a
Probably
lot
not.
of Yeah, I've read a lot of stories, and Ian hasn't been very complimentary about David. Um, and I think Ian was probably my favorite drummer in Whitesnake in that
Right.
classic period. He was the great driving force, but I think there a lot of maybe the animosity in that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with like Ian dates back to how David hired and fired players.
Right.
And there are some, I mean, I know David has done a lot of amends with ex Whitesnake folk to bring them back into the fold and, sort of maybe apologize or maybe just reconnect.
Right.
But there are some people that haven't forgiven him, like Mickey Moody doesn't want to have a bar to do with him because he hasn't
Right.
forgiven how he got dropped for the Slide It In. So maybe there's some old grudges that go beyond the Mark III
Well, if you look, and again,
dealings.
we've used the reference. Paul Diano's made it no secret. He said Bruce is the best singer Maiden's ever had. He said he's brilliant. He's
Mm,
great. And Bruce and Steve and those guys, they all talk kindly about Paul. They don't say negative stuff about him or anything,
mm,
you know. And it's not too unlike, the Ozzy Dio thing, One came in and took over the other guy's gig, and now he's the guy, and he's not the guy, and who's. And the fact that there was almost literally no crossover of those eras, as we mentioned, it doesn't cause those marks to harmoniously work with the next one because they're almost kind of road marks in the sand where there's a checkpoint that says, okay, you're on this side of the fence, now we're going on this side of the fence, and there's not much, if any, crossover. um,
absolutely.
yeah, so I mean that makes that challenging.
Yep.
So and I don't want to see guys at that stage, have animosity with each other. So again, back to the original, I thought Glenn's comments were very. They don't open up for forgiveness, and they certainly don't open up for reconciliation. If you say I'm never going to talk to him again, that's a pretty hard line in the sand. And I think that is a little extreme. I'm not saying he has to hang with them or like them, but if they can all just respect the Deep Purple legacy and that they all had a part of it, you know.
All right, Pete. So at the end of the day, my view is that I think Deep Purple Mark III is legendary status in the scheme of the Deep Purple story. What about you?
Yeah, they have to be respected.
Yep.
And the acknowledgments are well earned. They proved it in the studio, they proved it live, and they made the band advanced. You could say, were they bigger? Maybe they didn't have the sales, in the numbers or the charts or any of that kind of stuff. That wasn't their measure, but they certainly didn't disappoint. You and I are huge fans of all of their
Yep.
Mark III stuff. So, yeah, I would agree.
Absolutely. Pete, always a pleasure to have you on. This has been a fun conversation, and it's just basically our opinions and exploring the options. The Deep Purple family is the gift that keeps on giving. There's so many angles and tree trunks that we need to explore and will be exploring during the course of 2024 and beyond. You can see Pete Jones on the Contrarians and many other shows. Just type in Pete Jones. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Tell us your thoughts on Mark III Deep Purple, maybe your favourite Deep Purple album. But one thing's for sure, me and Pete will be doing more shows. Catch you later. Cheers. See ya.